Good morning, everyone. My name is Walt. I'm the pastor at High Rock Cambridge campus. It's good to be with you today. When I was in high school, I went out for all the sports teams that you couldn't get come from. If you had a pulse and you were willing, you could be on the team. My freshman year, I joined the wrestling team. I wish I could say I was some wrestling stud like Pastor Dave was back in the day, but not exactly the case. I got pinned every single match. So after a year of getting my body and ego bruised, I traded my singlet for a Speedo, and I joined the diving team. Diving was fun, but it didn't really get me a lot of street cred in my all-guys high school. Hopefully times have changed for any divers in the room today. I rounded out my illustrious high school athletics career with a few semesters of cross-country running. I went into it thinking, this is going to be my jam. I was fast over short distances. Was there really that much difference? It turns out that, yes, there is a difference. I was squarely middle of the pack, sucking wind, dry heaving at the finish line. But the best part was the announcers, because my last name is Quick. So here I'd come, plodding in, and I'd hear, and finishing 88th today is Walt Quick. Looks like he's not so quick today, is he, Jim? No, Bob, he's not. Never got old. Since then, running has just been a spectator sport for me. My wife is a big runner. We have a lot of friends and family who are into it, so I've been to my share of races. I'm especially fond of the carbo loading that takes place the night before and the after parties following the race. You could say I'm into running for the eating, but I know that what motivates Jen and my friends isn't the pasta. It's that feeling of satisfaction and accomplishment that comes from crossing the finish line. It's looking at the distance they have never covered before, the time that they have never hit, and thinking, I'm going to do that. And then they spend several months putting in blood, sweat, and tears so that when the big day comes, they are ready. They get on the course, they fight through the pain, they dig deep, and when they cross that line, man, it is a sweet satisfaction. If you're a runner, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If not, maybe you get that feeling of completion from other sports, or from gardening, or writing, or cooking, or doing incredibly elaborate puzzles. These hobbies and activities are important to us because they give us an opportunity to feel satisfied in our work. And it's great when we have moments where we feel like something that we have put our hand to is actually finished. Because so often in life, we never experience that feeling. Our lives can feel like a race that never ends, where there's barely any space to catch our breath, and where we constantly feel like what we are doing isn't getting us any further along. We're never finished. Some of it's fairly trivial. We take great care to shovel out our parking spot or driveway only for it to be plowed back in a few moments later or go another round of snow the following week. Or, as I've recently been discovering as a new dad, changing a baby's diaper before you leave the house is a stone cold guarantee that there is going to be a massive eruption once you're 5 feet out the door. But more often than not, the things that are unfinished weigh much heavier than a dirty diaper. We've been on our career path for a long time, but no matter how hard we work, the position we want is just out of reach. We never make partner or VP or get the funding we need for our startup. Or maybe we've gotten exactly what we wanted, but the feeling of satisfaction wore off almost overnight. Was that it? Now we are wondering what's next. What's a new thing to be chasing after? Perhaps we have a vision for our family life, good relationships with our kids or parents or spouses, but no matter how hard we pursue it, our loved ones remain a mystery to us, or feel like we are one off-color comment away from breaking a fragile peace. Maybe we have aspirations for making an impact in our community, but no matter how many hours we volunteer or how many committees we serve on, there are still mouths to feed, youth to tutor, and systems that are broken. And what about our spiritual lives? We yearn for a deep connection with God and awareness of His presence, but often God can feel hidden. A temptation we thought we'd overcome continues to creep up on us again and again and again, no matter how hard we fight. As a result, we are exhausted. We're just wiped out, running on empty. We're discouraged. But because we are a group of highly capable and qualified people, when we reach that point, we don't stop. We double down. We shift into a new gear because if anyone can solve this problem or fix this relationship or amend the system or reach that position, it's us. And we craft these narratives in our minds to keep us going well beyond the point at which we thought we should have stopped. I have 4 words that constantly run through my head. You're not doing enough. More often than not, these words are with me when I wake up, all throughout my day, and when I hit the sack at night. I could have put in a 14, 16, 18-hour day, and I still think about what was left undone and what I need to do to get ahead tomorrow. I bought into the idea that I need to do things to be seen as worthwhile, and so I do the things. And there's a real irony to this because I'm actually kind of lazy by default. If you're familiar with the spiritual personality test, the Enneagram, you may have learned about type 9s and how their vice of choice is sloth. That's me. But here's the kicker. After being in Boston for almost a decade, I've learned that you can be a lot of things. You can be a workaholic. You can be overambitious and driven. You can notch your belt with all the all-nighters that you pull, and you will be praised and admired for all of those things. But the one thing you can't be is lazy. You can brag to your friends you spent all weekend in the office or lab, slept in your work clothes, not even stopping to shower, and that's going to get you some high fives. But if you spent all weekend in your PJs, watching every episode of the Great British Baking Show on Netflix, not even stopping to shower, that's going to get you some strange looks. Even though, to be fair, that's pretty impressive. And beyond that, our culture has taken what are healthy rhythms of work and rest, practices of relaxation and Sabbath, and branded them as lazy. You want to take a day off? You aren't checking your email into the wee hours of the morning? Then you must not care about your work that much. You might just not be that determined or dependable. So seeing that this is what our culture values, and because I want to be valued, I have shifted hard into that mentality. As a result, it's hard for me to feel satisfied with anything. Even when things go well, it's on to the next one. What's the narrative that drives you? Do you have a mantra that's constantly running through your head? I have to be number one in my class or in my company. I need to be the perfect parent so that my kids will love me and go to the best schools. I have to shore up my retirement account so my future is secure. I need to keep impressing and spoiling this person that I love. Otherwise, they'll leave me for someone better. People will never respect me unless I'm head and shoulders above everyone else. Be better looking. Be funnier. Be a better Christian. The psalmist observes, "It is in vain that you rise up early and go to rest late, eating the bread of anxious toil." Why do we work so hard for the bread of anxious toil? Why do we buy into these narratives that push us to places we hate being in? Places that ultimately never give us what we really want. It's because we believe that at the end of whatever road we are running down lies the thing that will make us whole. That if we get those accolades, or that fellowship, or that relationship, or those rights, or that respect, or that security, if we get those things, we will matter. And we will be satisfied. We will be complete. In the film Chariots of Fire, real-life Olympic sprinter Harold Abrahams was quoted as saying, "I have 10 lonely seconds to justify my existence." Abrahams was literally running after this feeling. If he could win the race, he had it. If he lost it, he didn't. He desperately wanted the world to know that he mattered, even if it meant chasing after something that was always going to be elusive. He won plenty of races, but there was always another one to be won or lost, chance to justify himself or not. Like Abraham's, we want to be justified. We're quick to acknowledge that there is something lacking in us, something incomplete. We want to be made right. We want to be made whole. And yet, because we often don't fully understand what it is that is lacking, we chase after the things that we feel like we need, and we never get them or the feeling that we have finished. We're nearing the end of Lent and our sermon series on the 7 last sayings of Christ from the cross. Over the course of several hours, Jesus had been hanging on the cross, dying. But instead of words filled with bitterness and curses, the words of Jesus were marked by forgiveness, care for others, compassion and assurance, dependence upon God. And now, this morning, we will look at Jesus' final saying, "It is finished." If those words were coming from anyone else being publicly executed, we'd simply think, they're done, dead, it's over. But as we have watched Jesus on the cross these past few weeks, we know that Jesus wasn't dying like anyone else was. Everything about Jesus was intentional and deliberate, even as he experienced immense suffering. Jesus had a vision in mind, a reason behind why he was enduring what he was enduring. And now, in this moment, Jesus tells us that he had accomplished exactly what he had set out to do. But what he was working towards wasn't just something that had begun that afternoon. It wasn't something that had begun even at the beginning of his life. What Jesus finished was a work that had begun thousands and thousands of years and countless generations ago, all the way back to the very beginning of things. The creation narrative in Genesis tells us how God created the world for good and created mankind in his image to enjoy relationship with God and with each other. Together they would set out to fill the world with the goodness of God. It was going to be amazing. But they didn't even make it out the door before they bought into a lie that they'd be better off running their own lives instead of trusting God. And believing that lie changed everything. It broke Adam and Eve's connection with creation, one another, and with God. We had been created to continuously delight in relationship with God and each other. The work that were intended to do was going to be deeply satisfying. Our relationships were to be intimate and enriching, and we would be at peace with ourselves. We would feel whole and complete. But because we have separated ourselves from the source of that wholeness, we have been desperately searching for it ever since. We have been feasting on that bread of anxious toil, hoping it will satisfy us, hoping that one day we would feel that sense of completeness, and yet it continually eludes us because it's not the real thing. This is what sin is. Sin is more dynamic than a list of things we shouldn't do. Sin is about an erosion of our relationship with God and with each other. We all try to patch things up ourselves, but we fail. And so we need God to do the work that we cannot. God could have said, "It is finished," right there in Eden, but he didn't, because it wasn't. God was still committed to bringing his good plan about. God was going to reconcile humanity back to himself. He would make them one again, no matter how long it took and no matter what the cost was. Long after that, God formed a group of people into a nation, Israel, that was going to be unlike any other nation. They would be a people that were led by God, taught by God, informed by God in a way that would share his purposes with the world. God rescued them out of slavery in Egypt and gave them laws to help them understand his character and the spiritual gulf that lay between them. They were loved deeply by God, but there was a lot of work that needed to be done to heal the separation that they had caused. Despite this, the selfishness and greed and injustice of the people continued to strain their relationship with God. And so God instituted a sacrificial system to remind the people of the ever-present reality of their sin and the costliness that came with forgiveness. But this wasn't enough. Think about it. What if we had one of those little spiral-bound notebooks in our back pocket, and over the course of the day, every time we committed a sin, something that erodes our relationship with God or each other, we wrote it down. Every time we snapped at our kids or roommates, every angry gesture we gave the other drivers on our commute, the little white lies we told to save some face, the prolonged glances at an attractive colleague. Each time we had a condescending thought about someone because they were of another class or gender or ethnic background. Each time we lashed out in anger when someone sinned against us. The times we chose bitterness instead of forgiveness. The ways in which we drew comfort from our bank account balance or appearance or grades instead of from God. If we spent a day doing that, I know for sure I need another notebook before my second cup of coffee. And if you ask Jen, she'd probably say I needed it before my first. It's just too much to count. It would be impossible to manage and impossible for any earthly sacrificial system to handle. So God established, once a year, there would be a day of atonement to cover all the sins that Israel had committed that weren't covered by other sacrifices. Atonement literally means at-one-ment, the process of taking two things and making them one. It was one of the most significant days of the year. And what made it so special was that the high priest of Israel would actually come into the presence of God to make a sacrifice on behalf of the people. The innermost part of the tabernacle, and later the temple, was called the Holy of Holies. And on this day, the Spirit of God would come down and would fill the space with God's presence. The high priest would prepare himself and then enter to seek forgiveness for all of the people's sins. It might sound cool to us, like we're getting backstage passes to hang in a VIP room or something, but it was actually a terrifying experience. If the priest had not adequately prepared himself or disrespected the ritual in any way, he would have died on the spot. So he actually had a rope with bells tied around his waist so that the other priests would know from the jingling that he was still alive. And if he died, they could just pull him out. They probably had to keep shimmying about just to avoid getting prematurely yanked. And upon completing this sacrificial ritual, he would have made atonement for the Israelites, whatever their sins had been. Then, finally, to symbolize that God had indeed removed the sins from his people. The high priest would take another goat, lay hands on it, and confess the sins of the people over it. The goat would be led into the woods and released into the wilderness to show that the sins had been removed from the people. God had provided a way for atonement to be made, and the people were given mercy instead of judgment. Then, of course, the year started over. People continued to sin. Sacrifices needed to be made. The Day of Atonement was something special and significant, but even that only did so much. Something more needed to be done. Something beyond merely forgiving sins, but dealing with the root of the sins themselves. Several years ago, I rather embarrassingly found myself in a driver retraining course after getting a string of moving violations. The state decided that me paying the fines wasn't enough. They needed to help me be a better driver, so I would stop getting tickets in the first place. We don't just need the consequences of our sin to be dealt with, we need the cause of our sin changed too. And that's what Jesus had come to do. The author of the Hebrews says that the sanctuary that the high priest ministered in was only a shadow and copy of what was to come. It wasn't the real thing. It was the sign that pointed to the thing. And it gave people a sense of anticipation that one day God would make an atonement for sin that wouldn't have to be repeated every year. It would be taken care of forever. Hebrews 10:11 reads, "Day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices which can never take away sins." Does that sound familiar at all? Day after day, we let our narratives run through our heads, driving us to exhaustion, frustration, and disappointment. They never leave us satisfied. They never bring about wholeness. They never accomplish the thing that truly needs accomplishing. What we need is something lasting and dependable. We need something that doesn't just wear off after a day or a month or a year, something that has been completed, something that is finished. We need atonement. And in Jesus, we have been given it. Hebrews 10 continues, "But when this priest," meaning Jesus, "had offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. For by one sacrifice he has made perfect forever those who are being made holy." What the Day of Atonement pointed to, but can never fully give us, has been fulfilled in Jesus. He's the high priest that goes into the presence of God on our behalf to confess our sins. But unlike the other high priests, who have to keep at it day after day, year after year, the sacrifice that Jesus made was sufficient for all people over all time. Why? Because he was more than just a high priest. He was also the sacrifice. The high priests of Israel entered into the presence of God hoping that they wouldn't die, but Jesus did so knowing that he would. Jesus was the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the world. A few weeks ago, Pastor Dave talked about forgiveness and how to have a conversation that acknowledges the reality of the sin committed, but also extends grace and provides a way for reconciliation. One of the parts of that conversation involves the honest acknowledgement of all the ways that one person has wronged another. Pastor Dave said it was his favorite part. He could get all the ways that he had messed up out on the table because he knew that in a moment he would be given forgiveness for them. On the cross, Jesus lived that out on a scale that we can only begin to fathom. Like the scapegoat, every sin by every person was laid out and placed upon him. Think about everything you know you have done wrong, and everything you didn't realize you have done wrong, and then multiply that by billions. Every sin we have ever committed, every sin that has ever been committed against us for everyone ever. And that is what Jesus took upon himself on the cross, so that it could be righteously judged and condemned, and so its power over us could be broken forever. This is the moment that God had in mind from the beginning of history, thousands upon thousands of years ago. This is how God would make a way for his people to be reconnected and reconciled back to him. It would cost God everything, the life of his very own son. But Jesus would do it. And he did do it. And now it was finished. God had made atonement for the sins of the world. And now all the benefits of that atonement are ours. There's actually been some debate about this in recent years. What best describes the atonement? What is the best way to understand it? Well, the Bible doesn't give us merely one concept or analogy. We are treated to an entire mosaic of rich, vibrant, colorful, amazing imagery to help us understand what Christ has accomplished so that we can savor it like a multi-course meal and draw from different aspects of it during different spiritual seasons. Paul writes, "When you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." We've talked at length about forgiveness and how God has canceled our debt because Christ paid it for us himself. A popular analogy is the courtroom, where we are guilty, about to be convicted, but then Christ steps in and convinces the judge to let him pay the fine instead. He pays the cost while we walk free. This is powerful. And in moments when we feel burdened by shame or guilt, we need to remember that God does not hold our sins against us any longer. But it is not the complete picture, even though I know many people who simply stop there. To begin with, God the Father did not need Jesus to convince him to forgive us. It wasn't like God was ready to blast us all, but then he saw Jesus on the cross and said, "Well, I guess that's good enough." No, the cross reflects the heart of God. It does not change it. Furthermore, we may have had one of the best days of our lives in that courtroom, but now that we're off the hook, what's to keep us from racking up a little bit more debt here and there? Our ledger might look different, but are we actually any different? Or do we just have the same old habits and problems that got us there in the first place? What if we get called in front of the judge again? Will we get bailed out again? Or will we get what's really coming to us? Friends, we can have hope because God's solution goes beyond just bringing us back to even. By making us one with himself, God has changed us entirely. We were dead, and he has made us alive. And not just by any regular life, but my new, rich, full life surrounded by God's presence and filled with his Spirit. Because we are now one with him, God has given us new hearts, hearts just like Jesus's, that love God, love others, and delight in following him. We are a new creation. Some days this life feels incredibly true. We find our anger subsiding or give more generously, or we stop running so hard after the things that used to give us meaning and value. Other days, not so much. We fall into the same old habits, or continue to struggle in an area that we never feel like we're making any progress in. Did Jesus actually finish anything? Being bitten by a poisonous snake is probably one of my top 5 fears. I seriously got the willies just looking up a picture for the slide. What could be more terrifying than knowing that venom is coursing through your veins, poisoning you, debilitating you, and quite possibly even killing you? How incredibly powerless that would make you feel. You would run to the hospital as fast as you can for the antivenom, the antidote. And if you got it in time, suddenly things would be very different. You wouldn't be healed instantaneously. But now, what's coursing through your veins is the thing that will heal you. You'll still be uncomfortable, but you don't have to be afraid anymore. Because now it is only a matter of time before the antivenom takes full effect, and you will be completely healed. In the same way, Christ's life is now coursing through our veins. His work is done. It is finished. On that day, he accomplished everything we needed for our salvation. And for those who have received his forgiveness, he is doing a renewing work now that will be fully realized when he comes again. So in this new life, we no longer have to fear powers and authorities, systems and principalities, whether they are earthly or spiritual. Jesus has scorned the shame of injustice. He has conquered the powers of evil. He is victorious over death itself. Through his atoning work, Jesus has forgiven our sins, defeated our enemies of evil and oppression, and brought us back into full, abundant, new life with God now and forever. Now, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God again. Brothers and sisters, this is our reality. And yet we all know it is a difficult reality to live into. We feel like those priests making sacrifices day after day. Our lives are hurried and frenetic. We still hear those narratives in our minds that we're not doing enough, that we need to work harder, that we have to keep up, that we don't make a difference, that we aren't enough. But it doesn't have to be that way anymore. These 3 words, "it is finished," should call us to stop. To stop our running, our striving, our exhausting pursuits of justifying ourselves. Aren't you tired? I am. Don't you want to rest? I do. Then let's stop this foolish race. Let's rest in these words. It is finished. There's nothing more to be done. There's nothing that needs to be earned, nothing that needs to be feared. Jesus has done it all. He has accomplished the plan that was in place since the beginning of time. He has made us one with God again. Sit in that truth. Enjoy it during a Sabbath day, or a long walk with your family, or lingering over coffee in the morning. Savor it. Delight in it. Don't just rush by or gloss over this life-changing, life-defining truth. I mentioned earlier that I have 4 words that continuously run through my head. You're not doing enough. Maybe you have 4 or 5 or 6 of your own. Let's replace them with 3 much better, much more life-giving words. It is finished. Let that be the new narrative that we ground our lives in. The first words we hear when we wake up, the last thing we think about when we go to sleep at night. God has brought us back to Himself, and now we get to enjoy new life with Him now and for all time. There is no better narrative to live in than that. Today, we get to come to the Lord's table, not to eat the bread of anxious toil, but to enjoy the bread of life. When we remember Jesus' death and partake of His body and blood, let those 3 words be renewed in your hearts and minds. We are taking Jesus into ourselves, just as He has taken us into Himself. Christ has done it. It is finished.